Hello, and in section 7.6, we are going to look at the human sensory system. Everyone should be pretty familiar with the five senses. We're going to take a more in-depth look at how the mechanisms for each of those senses works in the human body. So let's start with the structure and function of the eye. The sense of sight depends on receptors in the eyes that respond to light energy. If we just take a look at this diagram, we can look at all the different parts of the eye, their structure. The retina is right here, this layer, mainly at the back of the eye. It's the thin layer of tissue made of sensory neurons and two types of light receptor cells. You've probably heard of these, the rods and the cones. So those make up the retina. The rods are adapted for dim light. The cones are adapted for bright light. You can see that the retina, retinal tissue, ends up forming the optic nerve right here, where the optic nerve is. That leads to the brain, where the images are interpreted. Let's start at the other end, where the light enters. The path of light will travel in through the pupil. It's hard to tell in this diagram. The pupil is really a hole, and that's where the light enters. This is the iris right here. That's the colored part, or either brown, blue, green, depending on the color of the eye. Here is the cornea. You should know the name for that. It's that layer that protects the eye right here. It's clear. And light passes through the cornea and then into through the pupil and in through the lens. This is the lens right here. The focus happens in the lens. Then the light travels through the eye. This area of the eye is all called vitreous. It's that jelly-like substance. If you've dissected an eye before in middle school, I don't know if you have or not, but that's called vitreous. Light then strikes the retina, and then, just as we said, the rods and the cones are the cell receptors, the receptor cells that transmit those impulses through the optic nerve and then into the brain where the images are interpreted. We also have the choroid and sclera layers. Those are terms to know. And then these are muscles right here on your eye that move your eye. All right, now let's look at the structure and function of the ear. You know that hearing depends on receptors that respond to mechanical stimulation. So when we're talking about sight, our bodies are responding to light stimulation. And when we're talking about hearing and sound, their body's responding to mechanical stimulation. So we're going to follow the path of hearing, and here is a diagram that we'll be referring to in that. First of all, sound. What is sound? It causes the air to vibrate, producing sound waves. Those sound waves enter the outer ear right here and travel down the ear canal. Here's our outer ear. When those sound waves reach the membrane called the eardrum, that's right here, causes that eardrum to vibrate. It's a thin membrane. Those vibrations in the eardrum are then going to pass on to the three very tiny bones in the middle ear. This portion is the middle ear. It consists of the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Those are three tiny bones in the middle ear. Here's the malleus right here, the incus, and the stapes. Vibrations then in the stapes cause this oval window, and it's not labeled right there, but they cause that to move back and forth. It's a tiny membrane right there, and the vibrations there then cause fluid in the cochlea to vibrate. This is the cochlea. We've now passed on to the inner ear. These are all in the inner ear. The cochlea not only contains fluid, but it also contains cells that have tiny hairs in them. And when that fluid is vibrating, causes the hairs to move inside the cochlea and bend. And the bending of those little hairs produces electrical impulses which travel along the auditory nerve to the cerebrum. Here's the auditory nerve. So those impulses are carried along the auditory nerve. They are sent to the cerebrum in the brain, and they are interpreted as sound. And that is what causes us to hear. Damage to the auditory nerve, right here, or to the hair cells causes hearing loss. So now what about the semicircular canals? These are located in the inner ear, and they're very important to maintain balance. Just like the cochlea, they are also filled with fluid and lined with tiny hair cells. And this is the path or mechanism by which they help us to maintain balance. If, for example, your head tilts, causes the fluid in these semicircular canals to move, and just as we saw in the cochlea, that fluid movement causes the little hair cells the hair to bend on the hair cells. The bent hairs produce impulses, and those impulses are carried by neurons to the brain. The brain interprets those, sends an impulse back to stimulate either neck muscles to readjust the head position or to other muscles that can readjust their position in order to maintain balance. Now let's look at the sense of touch. Like hearing, the sense of touch depends on receptors that respond to mechanical stimulation. There are touch receptors that convert the stimulus into a nerve impulse. They are in the dermis of the skin, and they respond to changes in temperature, pressure, and pain. And here's a little diagram that shows a few of those receptors and what they might look like. Receptors that respond to very light pressure happen to be very numerous in your fingertips, eyelids, lips, tip of tongue, palms of hands. That's where you tend to find those kinds of receptors. Here, they're just showing light touch receptors right there on the diagram. There are receptors that are different. They respond to heavier pressure. Those would be found mostly in joints, muscle tissue, and other organs. Also, palms, fingers, and soles of feet have a lot of these kinds of touch receptors. You have free nerve endings also in your skin that extend into the lower dermis. Here's showing these free nerve endings extending into the lower dermis. And those are receptors, act as receptors for pain. Also, they act as receptors for sensations of itch and tickle. Pain receptors are in all of your body tissues except those in the brain. Temperature receptors, you can see some of those here. We have heat and cold. Those are also located in the dermis, and all of these give us that sense of touch. Now let's take a look at two more senses, smell and taste. Smell and taste depend on what we call chemoreceptors. They are receptors that respond to chemical stimulation. So it's different from light energy or mechanical stimulation. Smell and taste are dependent on chemical stimulation. Let's look first at the sense of smell. Receptors for smell are hair-like nerve endings right in here. I have an arrow pointing to those nerve receptors. Olfactory is the term that applies to anything to do with smell. Let's say we have some nice freshly baked chocolate chip cookies here. Those chocolate chip cookies have chemical molecules that are being released from them, and those are traveling up into this individual's nostrils here, right? And the chemicals from those chocolate chip cookies, the chemical molecules traveling into this person's nostrils, they act on the nerve endings right here, on the nerve receptors. And as they act on these, there is an impulse in the olfactory nerve that is sent all the way into the brain. Connects right into the brain there. The brain interprets the signal as a particular odor. This particular nerve is very close to the brain, so those travel very quickly right into the brain. If we look at taste, taste and smell are very closely linked. You all know that because if you've ever had a cold and your nose is plugged up, you don't taste things very well either. Taste occurs when chemicals from the source are dissolved in the saliva. Here's the mouth of this individual. And they contact sensory receptors in the tongue, taste buds. And you probably already all know the four tastes: sour, salty, bitter, and sweet. They cause changes to the taste bud cells. And those signals are sent to the cerebrum and interpreted as a particular taste. Here's just a taste bud and a sensory neuron on our diagram. So those are the mechanisms by which we smell and taste. Advanced ideas research any of the sensory functions in greater depth. We really just touched very lightly on the basics that have anything to do with senses, and you can go in greater depth on any one of these senses.